Okay, hey everybody, welcome to C3. I'm Kent Dobson. Thanks for joining us. I'm very, very excited today to have a guest. Casper ter Kuile is here with us. He's been in my earphones for the last couple of weeks with his new book, The Power of Ritual, which I really am resonating with. And I'm finding challenging, provocative, and kind of encouraging all at the same time. So really, really delighted to have him here. I'm going to hand it over. He can introduce himself better than I can. So a few words on that. And then after he talks for a while, I'll maybe ask a few questions and that'll be our morning. So again, thanks for joining us and I'll hand over the reins.
Thanks so much, Kent. And hello, everyone. Great to be with you. As Kent said, my name is Casper, like the friendly ghost, or as I'm having to say increasingly now, like the mattress. That's me. And as you can probably hear by my accent, I was born and raised in England originally, but both my parents are Dutch. So for those of you with some Dutch background, I'm on Team Orange. And I was raised in a really non-religious household. I grew up without any sort of faith tradition. In England, the religious landscape is very, very different. Only about 6% of people go to church on a Sunday. And so I grew up in a family and in a village where I didn't know anyone who was religious. And certainly as I grew older and came out in my teenage years, religion was either irrelevant or cruel. So it was completely absent. But at the same time, I grew up in a village, in a school, particularly a Waldorf school, which was very rich with ritual. And so had all of these kind of wonderful experiences that I later learned were not your usual school time activities, like dancing around the maypole on May Day, or making little lanterns and walking through the streets singing at Michaelmas, or going to the local farm and singing to the cows and the chickens and the bees and the sheep on Christmas Eve. And so we had this wonderfully rich texture of ritual that gave me a sense of time, of moving through the calendar year in, year out. And those rituals have shaped me deeply in ways that I'll talk a little bit more about. But I want to step into this conversation about these secular and the sacred, this kind of divide that we have in our language and in our culture, by just familiarizing ourselves with some of the broader trends in American religion right now. You might have seen a few weeks ago, just before Easter, there was a new poll from Gallup that illustrated that for the first time since records began in the 1930s, less than 50% of American adults are now a member of a religious congregation. That is not a new story. I'm sure you're very familiar with the increasing trends towards disaffiliation. So more and more people saying they are less and less religious, at least when it comes to the institutions that they're part of. What I'm always really interested in is that people who are not part of a traditional congregation, but who are still yearning, curious, exploring opportunities to be part of a community, to find ways in which to transform the world around them and their own lives, that places where they can be creative and explore their purpose, and places where they're held to account for the values that they say are important to them. So knowing that that's something that you all have in common, I'm really going to invite us to look at that population, as it were, sometimes described as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who are unaffiliated, but not necessarily outrightly hostile or completely atheistic when it comes to religious tradition and belief. So in that group, the data tells us that 2 out of 3 still believe in some sort of higher power or God, and 1 in 5 even pray every day. And so already when you just look at the statistics, you can see that there's this middle ground between this solidly religious and this solidly secular perspective. And looking at what these people, of which I am one, do is what a lot of my research is focused on. So together with my former classmate and now co-founder Angie Thurston at Harvard Divinity School, we started to look at the places that people are going that are ostensibly secular, but that seem to meet some of those hungers, those longings that we might describe as spiritual. And so just as I had grown up with these rich rituals as a young child, I've always been interested to look at the practices that people have. What are the things that people go and do? Where are the places that they go, and what do they do in those places? Because too often I think we think about religion as something that's defined by belief, which is a real inheritance from a kind of Protestant framework of understanding what religion is. If you look at, certainly religious traditions like Buddhism, Hinduism, even Catholicism, and certainly Judaism, so much of what makes someone religious is what they do. Do they venerate elders? Do they eat a certain diet? Do they practice certain rituals? And so when we went out into the world of these nuns and went asking, what do you do? Where do you go to find community? The stories that they told us were surprising, but they really made sense. For example, one of the most important communities folks would talk about again and again were their fitness communities. So not just places that they would go and work out on a machine on their own and then leave, but communities that exercise together, usually in a class format. So two case studies that we spent a lot of time with were CrossFit and SoulCycle, two communities where originally people might come because they wanted to get a hot body or they wanted to lose weight or get stronger. But the reason why they stayed was because of the community that they experienced or the breakthrough that they felt in themselves whenever they were having a workout. So we heard stories of people looking after one another's dogs if someone went on holiday, of raising money to support someone's breast cancer treatment, even of asking their fitness instructors to officiate their weddings, and hosting leaving barbecues and comedy nights, and all the kind of things that you might expect to see in a congregation were happening in these spaces that were ostensibly about fitness. Some of them were even getting involved in local social justice campaigns, for example. So it was striking to us how a physical activity that people did together would build into this community of meaning that started to resemble a congregation. So again, if we're looking at these boxes of like, this is religious, this is secular, these communities kind of, got stuck in the middle. The somewhat disgraced at this point, but former co-founder of CrossFit even described it as a cult. He really embraced that language. And certainly when you ask people, who are CrossFitters, they are famous for their kind of evangelical zeal because their own life has been changed by CrossFit. And now they want to change your life with CrossFit too. So again, another one of those echoes. But it wasn't just in the world of fitness that we saw communities like this. We saw them among arts communities, amongst justice groups, addiction and recovery groups. Another one of my favorite examples was the Dinner Party, which is a community for people in their 20s and 30s, so younger people who've experienced significant loss. So it might have been the death of a parent at a young age, or a sibling, or another loved one, which has really impacted their life. And the very simple invitation at the dinner party is to bring a dish and come to someone's house who is going to host a space for storytelling. And so over a meal, usually with a group of people that will see one another over and over again over the years, they'll tell stories about their life after loss. And not just the grief or the sadness, but also sometimes the anger or the relief, or the moments of joy that they haven't been able to share with the person who's passed. And over time, those communities, again, look like a small group that you might expect to find in a congregation. These are the folks who would gather together and remember the people who they miss. They would celebrate one another's achievements and commiserate in one another's sadnesses. So again and again, we saw these secular organizations doing these spiritual things and really inhabiting a sort of spiritual entrepreneurial landscape, this new category of community that does what it says on the label, but also does a couple of things that are behind the label. Just a deeper sense of community that people feel part of. So much so that this is the community that they go to when they receive a difficult piece of news, perhaps a diagnosis or a death in the family, right? That these are the folks that they turn to for pastoral support, again, in the way that you might turn to a rabbi or a priest. So as we looked at this kind of landscape, as we surveyed this landscape, it really tells a story of how religion is changing in America. And that the simple stories like the Gallup poll, which says, well, yes, the numbers are going down, it's an incomplete story because we're seeing institutional decline, but I think we're seeing a sort of spiritual transformation or a religious transformation, that the longings that we as human beings inherently have right? The longing for meaning, the longing for purpose, the longing for connection, that we still have those. It's just that we're taking them to different places. Another trend that we've looked at more recently with my team at Sacred Design Lab is to notice how people, especially younger employees, are bringing those longings to the workplace. So people are coming to work expecting for this to be a community of meaning making, that these can be people who to talk to after, a mass shooting has occurred, for example, or looking for meditation classes or other kind of spiritual well-being offerings that you wouldn't expect to find at work, but nonetheless, people are coming to work with those kind of hungers. And that's bringing up all sorts of ethical challenges for employers to figure out, well, how much do we respond to that? If we just deny it completely, we're leaving people without resources. But if we respond to it, suddenly you're in a situation where maybe you're sharing things that are quite vulnerable, but you're suddenly sitting next to the person who can fire you, which brings up all sorts of ethical questions. So again, just an example of the ways in which I don't think our kind of inherent longing for these more spiritual things are declining. They are transforming. They're showing up in different places. So in my work at Sacred Design Lab with Angie and my other co-founder, Sue Phillips, we've really paid attention to what kind of language can cross this sacred secular divide, as you were, and to look for the words that have enough of an invitation and an imagination to stir up, to conjure up that longing, but at the same time don't immediately put aside or shut down folks who are either resistant to religious language or who feel like anything towards the spiritual is going to feel like it's too much. So we talk about those human longings in three ways, and I want to share with you these words because I think they're helpful for us in describing how to cross that barrier between the secular and the sacred. So we talk about, first of all, that the human soul, if you will, longs for belonging. This is a word that's everywhere now, which is fabulous. You see it on every college campus and you hear about it in every organization, the desire for belonging. And for us, that word belonging doesn't just mean a kind of intimate friendship or close social relationships. It also includes those familiar faces of folks whose names you might not even know. I think one of the experiences, certainly during COVID, that I had was realizing that those tertiary relationships, right, those folks at the edge of my social circle, actually also help make me feel like I belong when I see them maybe at a friend's party or I see them at the train station or whatever it is, that there's a sense of belonging that comes from multiple layers of relationship, from the most intimate to the casual to the ones that we maybe don't know the names of. Belonging is also related to place and to history, a sense that we belong to a lineage, perhaps, or that we have a relationship with the land. So you can see the ways in which belonging has kind of a multi-layered nature to it that goes far beyond just an intimate type of friendship. So that kind of longing is very much out there in our culture right now. As we see rates of social isolation increase year on year, as we're spending more time on our own, of course, working from home, but also more likely to live alone and simply have less rich relationships around us. So that's the first longing, to think about belonging. The second is to think about this opportunity of becoming. I'm so glad that Michelle Obama has this book with the title of Becoming, because that word now also is out there in the culture in a new way. But this is really about the capacity that we have in ourselves to say yes to the invitation from life. That's a little abstract, but essentially what I mean is the potential to grow, perhaps in behaviors that are virtuous, grow into things that we find hard but we know are good for us, all the ways in which we can become the kind of person that we want to be in the world. And it's really important for me that we put that word after the word belonging, because belonging affirms inherently who we are and how we are. And then from that, because we have that rich anchoring, there's this invitation to growth. Because if we put them the other way around, as so much of the time we do in our dominant culture, right, we're stressing achievement, we're stressing that we're not good enough, we're stressing all the things that actually are deeply, inherently unhelpful and embody so many of the kind of supremacist ideologies that have harmed so many of us, especially folks of color. So we talk especially about belonging first, then this growth and orientation of becoming. And then finally, this conception of connecting to something beyond ourselves. So in that beyond word, we think about the way in which we can feel part of something bigger than ourselves. I love this image of thinking of that beyond category as moments when, it might be looking up at the night sky, or looking at a very delicate small flower, or holding a newborn in your arms. Moments when we feel both absolutely tiny in the vast scale of the universe, and yet at the same time completely full of life, right? So that we're fully big and fully small at the same time. So again, as we're kind of navigating, working with religious organizations, working with secular organizations, these three words of belonging, becoming, and beyond give us a little bit of a framework to think about our own lives, but also to think about how we can serve and design for the kind of soulful needs of people today. So as you think about your own life, and as you think about your incredible community, that might be a good provocation to think through how are we serving people's belonging? How can we invite people's becoming? And how can we connect people to something beyond themselves? So with that, I'll welcome back Kent and look forward to some conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Casper. That was rich, to say the least. I think one of the things that struck me just as you were speaking now, is, first of all, I love the way you're phrasing belonging, or I mean, the way you're phrasing longing, because longing is hard to get at. It's hard for people actually to accept that they even have desires, and to go deeper to even know to what those desires are pointing. So saying it in such a clear way, what you mean by spiritual longing, I think is very helpful. So yes, spiritual longing manifests itself in a desire for belonging, in a desire for becoming, which is hard. This is one of the things I was surprised about with your book. You're saying this isn't easy. This isn't just like whatever you like to do, we're going to call spiritual. That's not what you're saying. Or whatever you like to do, even we'll call a ritual. It might ask something more of us in terms of becoming. And also the longing for transcendence. That's the way I would put the third one, or what's beyond. It seems to be a kind of universal human reality that we have this longing. So I guess my first question is something like this. Does ritual help ground these longings? And if so, how? And maybe can you give us an example or two?
Yeah, well, I love that you mentioned that it's not easy. One of my dear friends, Sue Mosteller, who's 87 and has been a Catholic nun for more than 70 years of her life, I think at this point, maybe just about 70. She says very clearly, I'm still becoming, and it's incredibly hard. So it's a good reminder for all of us. Yeah, I love thinking about ritual as a way in which we can express and explore these longings, because one of the things that works for me is that it doesn't immediately come soaked in dogmatic ways of like, oh, you have to do it this way, that there's actually a real creativity to ritual, but also an integrity. So it gives us an opportunity to kind of put those longings in a place or a moment in time. So to make that kind of concrete, one of the rituals that I write about in the book and that have been really important for me is my weekly tech Sabbath. I'm someone who struggles with a daily practice. I look in admiration at people who can, get up at 5 a.m. or make sure that they do this thing every day. I'm really happy with a weekly rhythm. So I love when Friday night comes around, I inspired by the Jewish practice of Shabbat. And really inspired by Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great Jewish theologian of the 20th century, who wrote a wonderful little book called The Sabbath that I highly recommend to everyone. But so inspired by those traditions, on Friday night, I turn off my phone and I turn off my laptop and I hide them in the bookshelf that you can't see, but it's just to the right here. And I kind of, have put them away, and I light a candle. And I sing a little song that I learned in summer camp in Dutch. And I stand there in the middle of my living room feeling a little bit ridiculous. But at the same time, it's this moment, right, in which those longings can get placed. It's this little bridge that I walk from kind of the normal work week and normal time into this time that I have set apart. And although nothing has changed in the world around me, through this ritual, there's a space that's made which can hold something deeper. And for me, what that looks like is, in those 24 hours, Maybe I'll get out the crayons, or I'll sing a little song. My husband's a musician, so we might make some music together, or I might try and I often journal, for example, so I might try and write a poem. So there's like a space making that happens, which allows something more to emerge. And so that particular ritual has been enormously helpful to me over these last, at this point, 8 years, 7 years. Yeah, it was a significant amount of time. And I think those rituals grow deeper with time. Joan Chittister describes kind of moving through a ritual calendar, right, where we practice those moments year after year as a process of spiritual ripening, which I love that image, that we kind of grow like a delicious fruit on the vine. But there's a sense that in the repetition of these rituals, we actually allow for something deeper to emerge, that they make more and more space in our lives and in our hearts, perhaps, for these longings to emerge. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Do you have rituals that are important for you, Kent, that have been kind of formative?
Oh, I don't know. That's tough. Because I was raised in almost the opposite culture that you were, which is very fundamentalist culture, very strict on times and places and what spaces you're allowed to do certain things and what spaces you're not allowed to do certain things. So I've had my own reaction to those. But interestingly enough, I'd say that I feel more and more, the older I get, the pull toward the kind of rhythm that is, it's almost like there's an underlying wisdom beneath some of the dogmatic do's and don'ts. There's still an underlying wisdom, and I'm surprised by it. And the funny thing about Shabbat is that I lived in Israel for a few years when I was in graduate school, but the Shabbat it's not an idea. It's not like a metaphor. It's not like, well, if you just understand the concept metaphorically of rest, then you'll get it. No, you either are doing it physically or you're not doing it. And the rules, surprisingly, are life-giving. That's how it was in Israel. Things are shut down. So you better get to the store by 2:00 p.m. at the latest, otherwise you're screwed. So it's these can feel like a burden often can liberate in kind of surprising ways, especially I think as you soften into it. I connect with marking also space ceremonial. I'll sometimes lead wilderness retreats, and I might invite people, or I might myself do a kind of ceremony. Let's say someone needs to let something go, or they want to express something, or even a longing, just to mark the moment, like what you're saying, with a candle, set up some rocks, call this space the place where I'm doing this ritual rather than this place over here. It's like the soul comes alive. That's my experience. It's like something deep says yes to that, which actually there's a kind of paradox, and maybe you could speak to this for a moment, because first of all, I really resonate with the general critique that we've made too much of the split between sacred and secular, especially in the Protestant world, big time separation, sacred, secular. However, there is something to be said about marking spaces as sacred. It helps us, like you said, it's a bridge. Something is different right now about this space, about this place, about this time, about this text that I'm about to read, or whatever the case may be. Maybe if you could just maybe speak to that paradox about needing the division and also it being kind of an illusion in a way.
Isn't that great? I love that question so much, Kent. And you're so right. The way I think about it, and I learned this from Jeff Lee, who's a former Episcopal bishop in Chicago, but he would say that ritual does not make things different. It makes things real. And that for me is so helpful, that it's not that I'm now making this corner of the forest or this moment in time on a Friday night more sacred than any other. It's just I'm helping me pay attention to the sacredness that is here. And so that helps me just shift my mind and realize, like, this isn't like a magical spell that I'm waving, a wand for, but it's really a way of making myself be present to the sacredness that is in this place, or that is in this moment. And so it's a tool to sharpen and focus our attention. as much as anything else.
Mm.
I love this kind of triptych of ritual making, which is you start with an intention, right? You're bringing a longing to it in some way that you're putting into this space or this time. You're finding a way to pay attention while you're doing it, and then you're repeating it over time. So intention, attention, repetition. It's a lovely way that you can really, whether it's gardening outside in the backyard, whether it's cooking a favorite recipe, whether it's snuggle time with the kids, on a Saturday morning, whatever, like each of these moments has that sacredness for me. And it's about tuning our awareness, our attention to be present to it, and to receive it. That's I don't know. That's how I think about that paradox. But it's so easy to shift from that and be like, well, now this time is holy and this time is not, right? And that's where I think perhaps institutional religion has gone too far, because it weakens the whole framework for me. It becomes like bland food, when actually there's so much flavor everywhere.
Yeah. And if you would, what's striking me now is the word repetition here, because again, I mean, we live in a culture that is habitual, but by way of addiction, not so much by way of intentionality. And people don't like, as soon as you say, hey, you should do this more than once, then it's like, wait a minute. I don't know if I want to go there, but maybe just speak to that concern if you could, the resistance we might have to repetition, but why it might be good for us.
Yeah, we're so obsessed with the new. I think that's very true. I mean, so much of my work is talking about innovation, and so I love new things, right? I love new expressions, new ways of gathering, new ways of making meaning. I'm all about it. But I think what's so powerful about repetition is, especially when something is repeated that interrupts the daily flow of life that we get caught up in, whether it's a capitalist worldview, whether it's a selfish orientation, which I am so guilty of, that rituals that interrupt that and say, no, now we're doing this. For me, that's what so much of the Sabbath is about, is it's a reminder that the world actually is not all about me, because it turns out I turn on my phone 24 hours later, I got one measly text. Nothing happened. I wasn't needed. Right? It's such a humbling moment. But it's a way of time kind of flowing into my life and saying, like, and I always say this out loud on a Friday night: the work isn't done, but it is still time to stop. Because it's not about making progress or finishing the to-do list or achieving this other thing that I said I would do. It's about, nope, it's getting dark, I have to shut things down. That's the gift of repetition, that it isn't up to me to decide when and how, because I'd always be looking for it to be perfect, or that just to finish this last thing before I shut things down. And suddenly it's 11:30. It's so easy for that to happen. So that's the gift of repetition for me, is its insistent kind of invasion, nearly, of what I would otherwise be planning for myself. Again, that can be wielded and become dogmatic and weaponized in a way that has been obviously extremely harmful. But I think at its core, the gift of that idea is that it gives us a structure. You used that word rhythm before, and I love that so much. John O'Donoghue was a wonderful Irish poet, and famously said the second best thing he ever did was to become a Catholic priest, and the best thing he ever did was to leave the priesthood. But he always said that a life of rhythm is a holy life. So that when we have those moments in the day, in the week, in the year, in a lifetime, when we're being held by that repetition, is a way in which we can live lives of integrity and meaning.
Yeah. And I think there's in the longing for wanting to be a part of something that's bigger than our, egoic consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, or our own narcissistic fantasies. I think we all carry that longing. We want to be part of something that's bigger, and Shabbat or other set times that you don't get to decide can be quite powerful. It jerks us out of that sort of ego-oriented, this is my life and these are my tasks and this is my role, and this is, all of a sudden we're a part of this larger kind of cosmic calendar that we didn't invent.
That's right.
Like that. And I think there's a connection here. If if you wouldn't mind, if you have time, if you wouldn't mind,
Yeah.
speaking a bit about sacred text, because this is a particular fascination of mine. I mean, I went to graduate school to study sacred texts, like biblical stuff.
This is your jam.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Although I also have some, I mean, this is what happens when you get into historical, critical scholarship and so forth. Then you also have a bad taste in your mouth. Like, what have I been fed all this time? And so I've gone back and forth. It's like, particularly with the Bible, like I've fallen in love with it. I've fallen out of love with it. I've gotten back together. I've broken up with it, this kind of thing. Now I'm much more at home with listening. And I think primarily listening in the way you describe in your book, with a certain kind of ear, how do you listen to sacred texts rather than what do I need to decide this text is or isn't before I can continue, but just how do I turn my attention to that, which also is like submitting to something larger than what I just invented or what I just tweeted or what my Instagram post that I'm trying to something like that. So maybe just a few words on sacred text and let's have a conversation about that.
Oh, I love that so much. Yes. And that shift was really mind-blowing for me, from thinking about, the thing that makes the text sacred is somehow, that it's written by God or it's inspired by, like that the thing that makes the text sacred is the text itself, to instead thinking about what makes the text sacred is our relationship to it. Is that a community of people comes back time and time again to this text to ask questions of ultimate meaning and concern. And that was just like so exciting to me, because it absolutely invited creativity for someone who hadn't grown up with the Bible or any sacred text in that traditional definition, to think about, well, what books have I reread time and time and again? What are the books that I always return to when I'm thinking about a big question? And so I ended up, partly because of graduate school and having this kind of shift, thanks to my professor, Stephanie Purcell, coming together with a classmate, Vanessa Zoltan, and saying, listen, why don't we read a text sacredly that's different, not the traditional Bible? And she grew up both very Jewish and very atheist, so she had her own relationship with text. And she'd been reading Jane Eyre for many years. And I went along to a little reading group that she was running of reading Jane Eyre as a sacred text. I was like, this is so cool, but there's only 4 people here. Why don't we do it with a book that a lot of people have read and a book that felt like that was authentically mine, right? That I had loved. And so we started reading Harry Potter as a sacred text. And that's been a project that's been part of my life now for nearly 7 years. We just finished reading the final chapter of book 7, the final book in the series, having gone through every chapter of the 7 books in the podcast, and doing exactly what you were saying of bringing questions to the text. We always read it through a particular theme. So we might have been looking for hope in a chapter, or justice, or revenge, or all these good, juicy questions of our human existence, to look what we could find in the text, but not just to talk about it as fans or to discuss it as friends, but to apply these very traditional reading practices drawn from the Christian and the Jewish traditions, like Lectio Divina, like Pardes or Havruta, these particular ways of taking a snippet of text usually, and then asking it a series of reflection questions, or putting 2 bits of text together to see what they might say to each other and then to us. And it has been just such a creative experience to realize that when you're rereading something with that close attention, the text is always new, because our lives are always different. That because it's a mirror more than just a static source, we're always seeing something new in the text because something new has happened in our lives. And to do it in community, so we don't get into a kind of a very narrow reading, that we're always listening to other people's voices. What is someone who's trans seeing in this text? What is someone who's experienced abuse seeing in this text? You're always finding new experiences because the readers have had experiences of their own, and to see how that sacred text can be so generative, right? That it can lead to new communities forming and new action being taken, new friendships being formed. That's just been amazing. So yeah, after 5 years of the podcast, and we ran it as an in-person class before that, one of the real kind of testaments for me of like believing in sacred text reading as a discipline was that when COVID hit, our listeners self-organized a mutual aid fund for podcast listeners. People who'd never met each other were sending money and support around the world because they felt part of something bigger than themselves, because they were treating the same text as sacred together. So yeah, if you want to start doing it with, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or whatever other book there is out there, I'm all about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, amazing. And I think, let's be honest about Harry Potter too. It's kind of an archetypal masterpiece. There's a kind of deep genius there that it almost, because it's so magical, it sort of evades the overly rational, this means this and this means that. And you're certainly confronted with certain energies and archetypes and powers and images and it can be overwhelming. I mean, as you said in your book, this brings up really challenging stuff for people. And
absolutely. And
reading in a sacred manner, opening, it's a kind of vulnerability that takes place.
Yes.
There's opening of the heart, an opening of the mind, and you're not sure exactly what the text is going to mirror back. And that's right. So profound and also challenging kind of at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's another way of allowing something to step into us, right? Like just with the Sabbath, we were talking about time, and here it's about narrative or imagery or story that can help us see something maybe we didn't want to see, right? Like, oh, am I like this character? Is that what I've done? Right. Or have I let this person down in this way? Or it can be a confrontation as much as an invitation sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. So maybe we can just sort of land the plane here. I'd love for you to respond, even though this is a bit unfair. I'm going to admit this is a bit of an unfair question. Because if someone asked it of me, my answer might be, I don't know. But anyway, here's the question. And it's something like, what do you hope this book will do in the world? What do you like if it's stirring a kind of cauldron, what do you hope it stirs up for people?
Yeah, that's such a kind question. My biggest hope is, and this is maybe a strange phrase, but that it gives people a sense of spiritual confidence. I believe so much that the things we're already doing in our lives are worthy of ritual moments, that they're worthy of our love and attention, of our care. And that, for me at least, that can be pretty much anything. I mentioned cooking and gardening. It can be playing games. It can be drawing or singing, or, I am so open to whatever the practices are. But what I hope that they can do, and this is what ritual does for me, is that it gives us a way to look beyond the everydayness of life and to see the things that are most important, the love we have for one another and the places that we live, the sense of belonging that we feel in the world, the sense of justice that we're called to, that each of those moments, right, that we can ritualize, building on the things that we're already doing, that they can be pathways into the world that we dream of. And so it takes a little bit of imagination and confidence to think that's true, and then to make it real by creating a bit of ritual in your life. But that's my hope, is that people can feel that sense of agency and authorship in discovering ritual in their own life. Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah, I think that's the place to end our conversation. I think I want to just say thank you. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for writing this book. I mean, writing is challenging, and putting it out there.
It's like being locked in a room with the most stupid version of yourself. I do not recommend it.
Exactly. Yeah, and to put it out there in the world, there's a kind of courage that's needed for that. So thank you for revealing a bit of who you are in this book, and your own hopes and longings, and also well researched. And I appreciate that. So I think I just want to say thanks.